Welcome to this webinar. My name is Francesca La Rosa from CMCC, Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change. And today I'm moderating this webinar that is a UMACS and Climate Europe webinar on behalf of Jaroslav, Mysiak. The topic that we are covering today is climate services in the finance sectors, insights from users and providers of climate data and information. And our presenter is Robin A. Hamaker-Taylor, that is policy and risk analyst at Acclimatise, together with Adriaan Perrels, the discussant coming from the Finnish Meteorological Institute, FMI, in Helsinki. So CMCC is a non-profit research organization established in 2005 that turned into a foundation in 2015. It is a scientific research center covering every aspect of climate change, focusing from physical scientists to physical science to socioeconomic impacts. Our work aims at stimulating sustainable growth, protecting the environment, and developing strategies for the adaptation and mitigation of climate change. The network that CMCC is covering is 5 cities in Italy, which are going from Venice, Milano, Bologna, Viterbo, Capua, Lecce, and Sassari. And the research topics that we are covering all across Italy are spanning across different divisions, which are again, we can see the name of the divisions that are spanning throughout the networks, which are covering both physical and economic impacts. We can go on with the slide. Thank you. Okay, so we're going from climate simulation and prediction to economic analysis of impacts and policies, impacts on agriculture, ocean modeling, and so on, spanning to different topics such as agriculture, but also urban areas, predictions, hydrology, forest simulation, oceans, ecosystem, and computing. We can go. Thanks. We see the topics here. Then next slide, please. Also, CMCC is engaged in outreach activities that are going from publications to the organization of events, and of course, educational activities and communication to promote climate change awareness across a different set of stakeholders. Now, moving to the specifics of this webinar. Next slide, please. We have is definitely a high participation at the moment, and to participate yourself, you can actually pose a question using the Q&A button, that is question menu, provided by the GoToWebinar system that you see in your screens. Whatever you are interested in actually promoting a question, just write it there, and we will make sure that your question can be raised. Every question will be recorded anyways, so don't worry at all if we don't have the time to cover all your curiosities, because the presenters are receiving them anyways and they will do their best to reply. And now I will leave the floor to Robin and to Adriaan that can introduce the topic of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesca, for this introduction, and also thank you to CMCC and Climate Europe together with UMACS stage this webinar. And thank you for all the participants to join in here. We are already approaching 100, I see. So a few words in general about EUMACS. I'm also the coordinator of this whole project, which is a Horizon 2020 project already in its final stages, twinning with a close by project called Marco. So EUMACS is dealing with how the market could be functioning better. So we are looking to all these obstacles and the mechanisms behind it. So what are then the options for better uptake in the nearby and further future? And Marco is looking to the market volume prospects. You could say that is the difference between the two projects. We do know that the term climate service as such may often raise questions, so people may understand it in many different ways. We basically relate to the definition in the so-called roadmap for climate service by the EU. So it should always be really based on climate-related data, but often in in transformed fashion and often together with other information to generate much more value added. So all kinds of customization and merging of other data and information. And it may be not at all only quantitative, it can also be embedded in all kinds of consultancy and training aspects. And it may not be only purely for adaptation, it can be for seasonal climate services. It can also be more related to resilience and DRR, or all kinds of mixtures of these reasons. So we are looking to the drivers, obstacles, enablers in this climate services market, especially also looking to the role of innovation, because of course a lot of climate services are still in a pilot or development phase. And there's of course already a set of climate services available, but the prospect for all kinds of new developments and innovations is really large, and that affects also how this may evolve further. There are three focus sectors with which we have been dealing really more in depth to understand better what are all these obstacles and drivers, and what are the specifics that climate service providers then have to take care of, that these sectors are well provided, well served. So that is the financial sector, about which this webinar is, tourism and urban planning. Furthermore, in order to support the development of this market, we are now developing 3 climate policy scenarios against the backdrop of different, we could say, policy regimes. So the different member countries and the EU as a whole can then see what packages of measures would probably help a lot to promote this. We also made some tools and guidance that you can find on our webpage. May I have the next slide, please? Yeah, a few words in the background why this is so difficult. Of course, this is an evolving market still, and partly it's not a market yet. A lot of it is public and even in development stages, so you won't observe it as a market transaction yet. The so-called value chain of climate service can be complex, but roughly one can distinguish 3 main stages: upstream, which is really more about observation and data and the hardcore modeling; then midstream, which is about downscaling data and looking to first line impacts, that kind of things. Also impact modeling maybe in that stage. And then downstream, which is really about the steps where you sort of start to tailor it for particular use purposes, or even really looking to delivering it to particular clients. When you looked into the different actors, of course, by their very nature, national Met offices are important players. There are also other public providers. In some countries, there are specific public climate service providers, like you could say CMCC is doing that as well, for example. And then there are several academic and other similar research institutes working in particular fields related to climate service. But there are also in some cases national or regional collaborative structures that are providing climate services. Could be even public-private corporations. There are also private firms, of course, especially at the lower midstream and downstream part. You will see there are all kinds of consultancy and engineering firms, etc., that can combine climate service with their already existing service portfolio, and then you get a much richer picture. But that is still very much evolving at the moment. And then there are also still, for example, some NGOs and some other actors involving. You can also see that some end users, so to speak, may start to move back, are starting extending after they've learned themselves. They may start to even offer climate service themselves. The value added of climate service is typically growing if you go through this value chain, and that means also then the share of non-climate data, so to speak, is increasing, and that makes the whole thing more difficult also to manage in several ways. And it also means that the nature of the product is changing from a pure public good to all kinds of mixed public-private characters for different reasons. And partly, and to a growing extent, we are also really talking about private, so commercial products that can be sold. So all this diversity indeed makes it quite challenging to explain how this works and what would be the best choices of ways to offer for different kind of climate services. May I have the next sheet, please? Thank you. A few words about the consortium. So we have 9 partners from different European countries with backgrounds in, indeed, of course, in climate service provision, but also backgrounds in like in living labs, in innovation processes, in economics, etc., etc. And also we have some of the partners have indeed a company background and so have another experience in providing for climate service than public agencies would have. That's also very important to realize this difference and learning from that. I think I leave it to here, and I'm very happy to give the floor to Robin to start with the real stuff, with the finance sector presentation. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Adriaan, and thank you, Francesca, for those introductions. So I'm Robin. I'm with Acclimatise, and we're a climate adaptation and resilience advisory firm. And we led on the engagement with the financial services sector and EU MACS. So I'll be sharing some of the results of EU MACS as it pertains to the financial services sector, as Adriaan's mentioned. And specifically, I'll be mentioning the demand we encountered in commercial banking and development finance institutions such as MDBs and development banks. So before I get started on sharing the results, I wanted to preface this presentation a little bit first and just say that by and large, finance actors and climate service providers operate in separate worlds, and they're just starting to come into contact with each other. So there are important exceptions, obviously, around insurance and reinsurance and in development banks. But these worlds typically have their own jargon and technical experts and important subdivisions and segments that exist, and these complexities within each of these worlds can make it difficult for them to interact. So I'm drawing attention to that here before I get started because in the EU MACS project, in general, we try to bridge the gap between users and providers of climate services, which operate in different worlds, and also because we're doing that here in the webinar. So that means I have a challenge of sort of trying to reach both of these audiences at the same time, and that means I may have to lose some of the nuance at times. So in our forthcoming summary report, which will be finalized in the coming weeks and available on our website, it goes into a bit more detail and nuance. But on this webinar, I will be covering climate service providers will be hearing some of the traits and needs of financial services actors. So I'll be reaching that world, and then also I'll be reaching out to finance actors looking to hear about what peers are using and get an overview of available climate services on the market. Also, we'll be sharing a tool or climate service matrix, which can be used as an internal discussion to facilitate internal discussion as financial services actors are starting to characterize their own climate service needs. So to cover some of the drivers that we found in the project, these are background drivers that pertain to the wider sector. So each of the segments of the sector will have specific drivers, but these factors help motivate the use of climate services in the sector broadly. And an important one is the changing regulatory landscape in Europe that we're seeing and we have seen over the last few years. So in France, you've got the Article 173 of the Energy Transition for Green Growth Law. It was adopted in late 2015, and it requires various disclosures around climate and environment from companies, banks, and institutional investors, depending on their size and circumstances. You've also got mobilizing central banks. So in 2017, a consortium of central bank governors formed the Network for Greening the Financial System, NGFS. And that involves the UK, France, Netherlands, as well as China, Germany, Mexico, Singapore, and Sweden, and their objective is to share and identify best practice in the supervision of climate-related risks in the finance systems in those countries and encourage the role of finance to mobilize green investment. So in the UK in particular, the Prudential Regulation Authority from the Bank of England currently has an open consultation paper on a draft supervisory statement, which the draft statement sets out expectations from banks and insurers around their approaches to managing climate risks for the financial risks from climate change. Also in Europe, you've got the high-level expert group and the European Commission Action Plan on a Sustainable Finance System, which published its recommendations in 2018, and it works to encourage a longer-term view that's typically considered than is typically considered in the finance system. So all of these things are sort of working to provide background motivation for the use of climate data and information in the finance system here in Europe. But also important is the sort of on the voluntary side, the TCFD recommendations, which we're probably all familiar with, but it's the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And that asks for, provides a framework for climate risk and opportunity disclosure against transition risks and physical risks. And TCFD, the framework, really puts physical risk on equal footing with transition risk. Transition risk meaning the transition to a low carbon economy, which is sort of well established, and there's a lot of interest in the finance sector already in that sphere. But it has put physical risk on the map, essentially, and sparked interest in climate data and information, which is needed to carry out analysis and disclosure of physical risks. So those are some of the drivers, background drivers. And some of the important obstacles that we have faced, that we found facing the sector, include on the demand side. So factors that impact the demand for climate services include low awareness levels. So this is not homogeneous across the sector or even within organizations. So there'll be banks that we encountered that may have environment or governance teams which are well aware of physical climate risks and the importance of assessing those, but their credit risk or stress testing teams internally may not be. So there's sort of an awareness, an importance of raising awareness. We also saw a lack of demand from the top of investment chain. So that means beneficiaries and savers are not yet asking or interested in physical climate risk, which has been given as sort of a reason why physical climate risk has, and then therefore climate data and information has lagged behind. And also there are important information gaps. So we found that financial institutions often don't hold important pieces of the physical climate risk analysis puzzle, including location data and asset level data, which is needed to even get started. And then obviously there are capacity issues. So there are a lot of other risks that are being analyzed, and there's limited bandwidth within all sorts of organizations to take on additional risk, including physical climate risk. And then skilled staff. So we saw it within banks in particular, there's a sort of lack of skills around GIS, for instance, which GIS would enable physical climate risk internally in a better way. So that's on the demand side. And on the supply side, we found these are factors impacting the supply of climate services to the sector. So research studies are not typically created for the purposes of financial risk assessment. So for example, agricultural studies which show climate impact, they may be designed to assess climate impacts on food security or other elements, but they may not be relevant for plugging into a bank's credit risk model as they're trying to analyze that loan book. And research organizations who produce these types of studies often have little awareness of finance actors and their interest in the use of those studies in that application. There are also important data gaps such as climate model outputs for the short and medium term, and those are important limiting factors. Okay, so before getting started on sharing the climate service demand that we encountered in the study for those two sectors, commercial banks and development finance institutions, I want to introduce you briefly to the climate service matrix. So this is a heuristic or a tool that we used in the project to structure our conversations with stakeholders, both users and providers. And it was developed by our research partners at the University of Twente. And it's based around constructive technology assessment, and basically it divides climate services, the climate service market, into four broad types. So we've got four quadrants here or stories of climate service use. And during the engagement part of the project, we took this matrix to stakeholders and sort of described each of these types to them to gauge their interest and demand for these types. So for maps and apps on the top left, an example would be data portals. So they'll be non-specific to a sector or group. They won't be related to a specific decision or a decision maker. They're typically free and or cheap to all users, and they're often provided by meteorological or research institutes, and they are only focused on climate data and information. So like I said, a data portal where you can gather information on essential climate variables, for example. On the bottom left, we have sharing practices. An example here would be a information sharing platform. So in the finance sector, something like SRI Connect, or sector association groups where best practices can be shared. And sorry, I can't see. Typically, these will be available to all users, and climate data and information can be integrated within existing platforms, but the platform may already exist and doesn't have to be only focused on climate. On the top right, this is expert analysis. So this will be typically advisory services on impacts to a certain type of project or infrastructure, and it will be very tailored, specific information to a specific context. It will only be focused on climate and is typically chargeable, so not free of charge. And then on the bottom right, we have climate inclusive consulting. So this is where climate data and information is integrated into other processes or services that are being offered. So an example would be a cost-benefit analysis that would be happening anyway that then now has a climate considerations integrated into it. And this will also be very tailored and customized to a very specific context and is chargeable as well. So when I show the results for the different segments of the sector, I will show it based on where the services that we encountered demand for sit within this matrix. And our summary report goes into the methodology behind this a bit more. And so for the sake of time, I'm not going to spend much more time on that, but happy to answer questions if that's not clear. And also, sorry, one last thing to say about this is that we use this as a tool to engage with stakeholders, but we also encourage the use of this and the exercise that goes behind it to further characterize climate service demand within your own organizations as financial institutions are sort of trying to figure out where to start in the vast climate service market. Okay. So this shows the climate service matrix of encountered demand for commercial banks that we encountered during this study. And so I say encountered because this is what what our stakeholders reported to us, but it shouldn't be meant to take what the entire sector says. It's just what we encountered during this study. So I'm going to share a couple of the big stories here. So it looks like so we did encounter climate service demand and use in all four of the categories, and actually one kind of set of examples that straddles a couple of the categories, which goes to show that these four quadrants are meant to be a sort of handy tool that are the climate service matrix is meant to be fluid, so these things are not hard and fast categories. But so while we did encounter use and demand in all of these four categories, sort of one of the biggest stories that has come out of our understanding with the commercial banks is that expert analysis is actually probably the largest demand right now. And portfolio level analysis within commercial banks is currently the most important and has been during what we've experienced during our study. And this is mostly driven by TCFD and the desire to carry out climate risk analysis and disclosure under that framework. So collaborative efforts through sector associations have through sector associations and groups such as UNIP-FI, they've been popular over the last few years, and they probably will be in the short term going forward. So we see in the banking sector and the commercial banking sector that while there are leaders The leaders tend to move in a pack together rather than on their own as individual actors. So this is why collaborative efforts are important. And this is creating demand for expert analysis around climate data and information that is helping to develop publicly available methods and resources that the wider segment can use. So examples are the drought stress testing tool or the TCFD pilot response by 16 commercial banks, both facilitated through UNEP-FI and other partners. Another big story here in the results with the commercial banks is that the banks are in the early stages of their climate service use. So while there are examples of use of maps and apps, which tend to be more on the upstream, kind of more raw data end of the value chain, less value added. And examples of use have been flood maps and climate data portals. There's still a strong translation for the translation of strong demand for the translation of that data into information which can be integrated then back into stress testing and risk assessments. So there is use here in maps and apps, but there's still a strong demand for the translation of that. And also, another final story maybe to cover for commercial banks is a strong interest in receiving climate data and information on channels which the banks already use, which would be in the climate inclusive consulting quadrant. So for example, the Bloomberg terminal, which most banks and financial institutions really in the world use, they have developed a function called Bloomberg Maps, which helps map hazards. And this has been, we saw that this is quite popular with commercial banks as it sort of gets at taking maps and apps information and translating it via expert analysis, but it's already integrated in a system which they already know and use and have paid for, essentially. So I think that's it for the commercial banks. And obviously there's a lot more nuance to this that's covered in our summary report, but that's a sort of high level picture here. And moving to development finance institutions. So for the purposes of the EU MACS report in the finance sector, DFIs includes national and subnational development banks, multilateral development banks, and international finance institutions. So that's the terminology there. The big story here is that these are much more advanced users, and they have been using climate data and information and climate services for a lot longer than many of the other segments of the finance sector. And therefore, they currently use maps and apps a lot more frequently, and they directly use these and have larger teams with which to access this information and don't have as strong a need for translation. There is still a demand. So the second big picture story here, there's still a demand for advisory services in this segment, but this tends to be on the project or investment level as opposed to the portfolio or loan book level, which was the case in the commercial banks. So there's strong demand for analysis around selection and prioritization of investments based on the resilience benefits, really. And also there's demand for advisory services as these institutions typically are starting to develop tools and services which then are available typically as maps and apps. So they're sort of so advanced that they're starting to develop their own tools and services, typically free of charge, and provide those. But they still need expert analysis to carry out that exercise. And actually, that's the third important story to come on to, is that these actors are effectively providing upstream services. And an example there is the World Bank in their development of the climate change knowledge portal. So they developed that for internal purposes and risk screening, but now this is publicly available for any other organization to use. So this is in the maps and apps category. And also they have started to develop, the World Bank in particular have developed open access learning around the use of climate data and information. So there's still a need for services, but it's much more on less on a portfolio level analysis, but on an expertise to develop services that can then be provided to the wider sector. And we didn't actually encounter any climate inclusive consulting examples in this segment. and that's probably perhaps because maybe because of their advanced status. Okay, so that's it for sort of the overview of the two segments, and I wanted to just come on to some of the tools and outputs that we have forthcoming. So all of these will be finalized in the next few weeks and available on the EU MACS website, which is linked there. So it's a summary report, which is has a bit more information on the climate service matrix and the exercise behind that, as well as a lot more detail and nuance on different climate service demands and different segments of the sector. We have a policy brief that's aimed at policymakers that is aiming to reduce some of the obstacles that I covered and suggest policy measures for that. And also we've taken our climate service matrix and developed a sort of interactive tool on our website, which will be available in the next few weeks, and also a frequently asked questions that can help users to try and get familiar with the different climate services available. And this is just a touch on our consortium again. And I think that is my last slide for now. So I think we will go to, oh, sorry, one more. Yeah, so we hope that you stay in touch. Our project has now ended, or it's ending in the next few weeks, as I said, but all of these publications and our newsletter and website will be up for the foreseeable future. So we hope that you stay in touch via these channels. And I think now it's time for, I'll invite Adriaan back to have a discussion on some of the materials that I presented.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Adriaan. Before leaving the floor to you, Adriaan, just a logistic remark. To participate in the Q&A, as many of you already did, just use the questions menu provided by the system of the GoToWebinar. And as I said, even if you're not selecting all the questions for lack of time, let's say, then the presenter will receive all of them. And now, before again leaving the floor to Adriaan, I would ask, let's say, one question that we received to Robin already, and then also Adriaan can jump in to provide like additional insights on the answer. We have a question from Carlo Bontempo, ECMWF, that asks how the requirements in terms of data and formats of the financial services are collected and documented. You can.
Okay, sorry, just to clarify, does it ask how our report collects these? I'm not sure if I understand the question. I'm sorry.
No, I think it refers more to data and formats, let's say. So data, standards, regulation, how these requirements of the financial services are collected.
Oh, I'm not sure if I.
And Carlo also comment saying that it has been partially answered, but so I guess that
okay, I think that I think the requirements are, I mean, just off the top of my head, I think the requirements in terms of data and format varies so greatly within the sector. I don't think that they're nicely collected and documented in any one location. I think our report tries to get at that, but Adriaan, I'm not sure if you have anything to add there.
Well, it's of course a very relevant question from a provider point of view. But in fact, a big part of the financial sector is still in a stage of having to do a lot of homework. So, in fact, partly specific specifications of what they exactly need are even not there because they are in this learning phase, you could say. And then I understand the question in general, sort of not in our project, but the extent to which this is in general done and somewhere available. As already Robin indicated, I don't think, I'm not aware of a particular place where this information is collected. By the way, also not from other sectors, at least not in a easily recognizable way. So yes, this is coming. We can say something about it. In the report, we also not so saying so much about it. As Robin indeed said, the diversity is so large that it gets really hard to say a lot about it. One thing that struck us, and is also already mentioned in some other publications and also an earlier webinar, I think here in this series, that a surprise was that even though the financial sector, of course, is an extremely data-intensive sector, so as such, it's not a problem to provide a lot of data, and they can handle and also analyze it very advanced way. But an essential feature, a lot of climate information, even enriched climate information that has a lot of other data, is often that it's georeferenced, so GIS data.
Mm-hmm.
That data format is very unfamiliar for the financial sector. So they have to step up there and acquire more skills and expertise, also inside the organizations, not only by probably, but also inside to be better able to exploit the benefits of climate services.
Okay, then we have another question from Sarah Corey that asks, what have you learned, if anything, from the insurance industry in handling and gathering data? So it's more in handling and gathering data. So it's more, let's say, specific on insurance.
So in handling and I'm not sure if I understand that part, but I mean, I think in the insurance segment, I think we saw the importance of the catastrophe modelers really in their role in the use of climate data and information in this sector. And so there's a lot of deference back out to the catastrophe modelers as well.
Okay, thank you. I think your replies. Adriaan, do you have any questions for Robin?
Yeah, well, let's first thank Robin for the excellent presentation. It was very interesting, even though I've been involved in this. In fact, I still learned or was again drawn attention to particular things. Really interesting. Thank you very much. And also shows how demanding this is to give an overall picture. There were a lot of places where a lot more could be told, but that is not possible in such a short time span. One question is about the task force for climate risk disclosure, the TFCD. That's a very important global initiative in the financial sector, which to my understanding indeed means that then at national scale or subsectoral scale, etc., that starts to be translated into more concrete kind of guidelines and perhaps pilots, etc., Could you say, for a start, whether you can already indicate to what extent that is really happening, this implementation, is that arising, and where and in what way? Can you say a few words about that?
Sure. So I think to be clear, the TCFD, as we may all know, does apply to both financial institutions and also corporates. So you do see a bit of movement in the corporate space, but as we're talking about the finance sector, maybe I'll focus on that. We've seen obviously a big pilot project with 16 commercial banks. Acclimatise and my colleagues and I were involved in developing the physical risk methodology on that. So I think there's a big sort of movement there within a large commercial international banks trying to come to grips with what it might mean for analysis of their different loan books and portfolios, also on the transition risk side as well. But independent of that big pilot project, we have seen movement from, again, some of the large commercial banks as well, and some of the large asset managers and asset owner firms starting to carry out TCFD disclosures. I think the uptake is a little bit slow. I think the sector is a bit hesitant no one really wants to be the first mover, it seems. But I think that I heard time and time again throughout the engagement with the stakeholders, it's a landmark development in the regulatory sort of landscape, and it's not going anywhere. So it may take a few years for sort of more fleshed out and more quantitative and moving away from the qualitative disclosures that we're seeing now. But I think yeah, the ball has started to roll really on that.
Thank you. Because that was indeed what you said in the end, what would be my next question, sort of to my understanding, we do not see yet emerging already a very clear demand for concrete indicator development. That is, as you said, there is still this sort of clarification case and phase going on. Does that also mean still that we may see first some additional sort of public regulation emerging before that? Would you think that is necessary? Or
well, it's,
what do you hear from the sector, let's say?
Yeah, I heard from the sector and also from regulators in the sector that that there's not a huge push to start regulating right now climate risk disclosure. So obviously in France there's Article 173, but I think some of the other regulators in the Netherlands and the UK are, you know, they're holding consultations. They're very much in talks with the sectors that they regulate and supervise. And I don't think there'll be an immediate push for regulation or very sort of onerous regulation around climate risk disclosure. I think that people, including regulators, would like to see how the voluntary framework plays out and see sort of the strength of the response to it before starting to do heavy-handed response on that. And yeah, so I think I don't see immediate movement on that in all jurisdictions. But potentially, yeah, I think that it's really important to note that there are, you know, like I said, the PRA in the UK, the Prudential Regulation Authority is even holding a consultation right now with the sector that ends on, I think, 15th of January. So there's still time to give feedback if you're in that sector in banking and insurance to give your feedback on what that might mean for you. Yeah, so yeah, I think it'll be a little while as well, and everyone's sort of waiting a bit on TCFD because it does have such weight in the sector.
Thank you. Now I have a question that also tries to now link the providers and the users in terms of trying to understand each other. One of the things what I remember where we got to some extent conflicting answers or information is the extent to which one wishes to do things collectively and share information. On the one hand, as you also showed in your matrices, there are really initiatives like these leading large banks doing things together. On the other hand, you see that on another point in the value chain, and also what we get some answers, you see that of course the products or the delivery of the products gets much more individual. And that is important for the providers because on the one hand there are these message providers that are collaborative frameworks to which you can provide as a climate service provider. On the other hand, there is need for things that are really client specific. And it's for both sides important that you understand that game. In the background, we have also been doing a bit of exercising to see if you would bet on the wrong track. In fact, you may in the end be able to extract less benefits from the whole process. We didn't discuss that here, but can you, hopefully also some of the audience can react to that, but what has been your experience? Is this indeed, is the sharing indeed really related only to the use of upstream or some midstream climate service or information, or do you also see sharing more downstream?
I think it would be harder to share more downstream value-added climate services amongst users, only because they'll be typically very tailored and specific to an institution. So they may those types of climate services or those risk analyses they'll pertain to a certain type of portfolio or loan book or asset class or something for a specific organization. So I think maybe in terms of what I've seen, there's sharing around the development methodologies that would enable analysis, sort of more downstream analysis. So, I mentioned the drought stress testing tool or the pilot of commercial banks to responding to TCFD. So there's been sharing of, a shared effort to produce methodologies that can then be used, which do use upstream data and information. But also, I think another thing to mention is there's probably a bit more willingness to share around risks than there are opportunities. And I think the opportunity piece, a lot of the whole sector in terms of the TCFD framework is still trying to come to grips with what that might mean. And so there's probably less willingness to share for commercial reasons in that area. So I'm not sure if that answers your question fully. But yeah, I think the sharing practices that we did see, which is the bottom left quadrant of the climate service matrix, if you remember, is sharing more general things like best practices and case studies rather than very sort of tailored analysis amongst the organizations.
Yeah, of course, that kind of supporting service can also be still important. I have another question, but I think it would be nice to give the floor to the audience.
Yeah, to the audience, because definitely we're receiving a lot of questions, both to Robin and Adriaan. So I'm picking one per person, let's say. So we have the first question from Robin, from Alberto Troccoli from University of East Anglia. To what extent is the uncertainty in climate data a limiting factor in the uptake of climate services? And how do you see confidence in user changing over the last few years? And if you can project over the next 3-5 years based on your experience. This is for you, Robin. But I have another one for Adriaan from Oriol Palom that asks, will UMACS project reports deliver a list of existing climate service providers working in the financial sectors? The floor is yours to both of you.
Okay, maybe I'll go first, but I think Adriaan, you actually might be able to help add on to what I might say here about uncertainty. So uncertainty is obviously really important, and also around the quality of the data is very, very important for to be included in existing risk management processes. I'm not sure if I can speak to how the confidence has changed over the last few years. I think the skill sets, if internally in organizations, are still developing to be able to use this. I mean, maybe with the exception of development banks who are highly skilled in the use of climate information. But I think that it was mentioned multiple times, the potential for uncertainty in climate data as a reason to maybe not be willing to initially engage. Adriaan, do you have anything to add?
Well, perhaps here it's also good to make a difference between the, let's say, seasonal climate services that you can verify, because after half a year or so you know how accurate it was, and the long-term sort of adaptation-oriented kind of climate service, where of course you cannot directly verify. You can only see how several other markets, like the real estate market or whatever, is reacting to the change in plans or so. So for this seasonal climate services, where you can also be much more pertinent about statistical properties of the data used. Yeah, as we know, and also from damage modeling and what is happening in the insurance sector. Yeah, of course. Then there is, of course, check of what are the properties and what can be matched, etc., etc. I think there's still a lot of sort of exploration going on, for example, on to what extent you can spatially downscale, for example, because then uncertainties may increase, but there may be other benefits to still do that. So I don't have also a pertinent answer. So yes, it is to some extent limiting, but then if you're already going so far that you are able to use the technical information, then the ones involved also know what they are doing. So it's not necessarily totally inhibiting then the use of these climate services. The other thing is if it is more about sort of generic information or long-term information from the several interviews and small surveys that we held, then the feedback gets more like, okay, if things are still unsure, then we're interested in it, but we are not willing to pay for it. So then you go back to this maps and apps kind of, they would be interested in that, but there is a clear difference, like willingness to pay for climate services means automatically in the financial sector that the quality should be really good. That's another lesson.
Okay, thank you.
There was another question, I think.
Yes, regarding the UMACS outputs.
Oh, right. Adriaan, would you?
If it's possible, if it is foreseen that UMACS provides a list of climate services providers for the financial sector.
It does, but only the ones that we encountered. So it's not going to be, it's not a full sort of survey of the entire climate service market, but it's services that that we encountered during our stakeholder engagement and providers that we encountered during that as well. So there are sort of tables in the annexes that do cover these.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I would say that we take additional 2 questions, depending also on the length of the answers. The first one is from Tyler Robinson, who asks, since the most significant demand from the commercial banking sector is in the expert analysis quadrant, what do you think are the key challenges in delivering services to meet this demand? And what is an example of a service that you think has succeeded in this space, if any?
Okay. I think some of the biggest challenges are probably, there are still important data gaps. So I mentioned a few, which actually are non-climate data gaps. There are climate data gaps as well. So there are certain sectors that don't have climate impact models. So obviously agriculture will be well studied, but sectors such as energy and studies which show the impact of climate change and changes in climate variables on the performance of and outputs and production of the energy sector, for example, energy production. Those types of studies are not readily available, and so there'll be large gaps for sort of translating the impact onto portfolios. In terms of the non-climate data, I mentioned before, a lot of the times financial institutions don't hold the location or the asset level data on their investments and their loans, and so that's a very important piece of the puzzle. And so I think that there's a bit of organization that needs to happen internally within banks and other financial institutions to sort of collate that information centrally to be able to carry out a large sort of top-down portfolio level analysis. So those are really important challenges that advisory firms are facing in developing those services. And I think in terms of an example that has succeeded, if we can, well, I'm not sure if I can go back, but let's see. There has been a lot of production of kind of gray, what I've been calling gray literature, and that actually straddles in between expert analysis and sharing practices on the matrix. If you remember, there was that output straddles those 2 categories. So that there's been a lot of expert analysis around generally talking about the potential impacts. So it's not full expert analysis in that it's not extremely tailored down to one portfolio or investment, but it's these guidance documents that are we're seeing emerge quite frequently from different sector associations that often rely on input from organizations like Acclimatise or other advisory firms that provide general guidance on how you might think about sensitivities and exposure within your portfolio. So that, as well as there have been sort of a few key TCFD disclosures by large financial institutions that have emerged as well. So yeah, while there are those challenges, there are still some expert analysis being produced.
Okay, thanks. And finally, a question for both of you. It was a very long question, so I will try to wrap up, from Daniel Funk, who asked if you see a conflict between climate service providers and the insurance sector with respect to the uncertainty of information. I guess that we can a bit enlarge the question beyond the insurance sectors. It tends to explain also that climate services provider intend to reduce the uncertainty and make it transparent, while the insurance sectors intends to keep some uncertainty because this is part of their business model and their, in a way, revenue model. Thus, the insurance is interested in uncertainty information, but has no interest, in his view, in making this transparent, so publicly available. And he finally asks, what is the consequences of the governance of climate services with this respect? So I understand that is a very broad question, but since uncertainty was actually very touched among our attendees, which are still more than 100, so thank you, then perhaps we can reinforce a bit on this topic.
Sure, Adriaan, please do feel free to jump in here with me. I don't think I would be super willing to comment on the business model of climate service providers or catastrophe modelers, perhaps, and their interest in not having transparency. I know that there are certain initiatives that have grown out of the lack of transparency around some of the catastrophe models that the insurance sector is using, and that is the OASIS Loss Modeling Framework initiative. And that is a sort of plug-and-play platform where different catastrophe models, which are more transparent, hopefully can be plugged in and used more easily and more transparently. Yeah, so I think just the fact that that has emerged goes to show that there is a bit of tension around some of the black box that exists around the catastrophe modeling.
Yeah, if I could add.
Yeah. Feel
Okay,
free,
yeah,
Adriaan.
there was a little in the sound. Yep, the question in fact also relates to quality assurance of these products, because if it's not certain how well the product performs, of course the willingness to pay sinks as well, and that also is related to the delivery model. If it's like a private good, so delivered specifically to every financial user separately, so which makes it difficult for every financial user to check what have been the experiences of other users, for example, then it indeed means you need some kind of system. So you at the mid-range, where, for example, the models are maybe available to some extent, as this loss and damage initiative that Robin was just mentioning, that may then be a way to find a compromise between need to have still client-specific non-open services to the end user. On the other hand, make it tractable both for the end user and other end users. What is the performance of that kind of models and services in a bit more general sense? And by having a common platforms for model types and perhaps also endorsed data sources and that kind of things, and there comes also Copernicus comes in, for example. If more upstream, you can at least ensure that the climate data are good. That already helps. But one point here I like to add indeed then is that in a lot of cases, and that is something that climate service providers should realize, the uncertainties are not only in the climate data. If you talk about eventual financial damage, it is in what is happening physically in that area. For example, maybe is there coming more dwellings in that area? Are there other activities there? Are the people living there well insured or not well insured? And so a lot of things that eventually affect what is the emerging damage and what is, for example, the potential to recover quickly or not in that area. And those data may have their own uncertainties again. So it's very important for a climate service provider to understand that the eventual performance of the product is determined by all these segments. And if you only emphasize the quality of the purely only the climate data, that may not be enough, or it may even be that then you use your resources not optimally. It should be a balance between the different things, but eventually is a good enough product.
Thank you, Adriaan. And since only 5 minutes left, I would just pose a bite question. Julie Julie, ask if, even though it is a bit outside the scope of the study that you presented, are you aware of any public sector application of the TCFD type risk disclosures?
No, I'm not at this point. Yeah, no, I don't think so yet.
And room for improvement, definitely.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess so. There is development banks have been starting to express their interest. So they're not exactly public sector, and there may be interest in cities, I think, at municipality level. But just because also they issue bonds and require investment and things, so they may be asked for this. But I haven't seen it yet. But again, I haven't been looking for it, so it could be there still.
Yeah, in fact, yeah. Also, what central banks are now doing in this cooperation of several European central banks, if you follow that closely, that may help a bit. Also, some national umbrella organizations, like the Finnish financial sector umbrella organization, has been publishing a report that is sort of detailing the guidelines at a more practical level for financial actors. Sort of do they have to go through a whole checklist to start to implement these guidelines? That is what the report is doing. That are the first steps in that direction.
Okay, then 100 people connected. We're super happy for your participation. If you can move the slide, Robin, then we can advert the next CMCC CISC webinar, which is focusing on the IPCC special report on impacts of global warming on 1.5 degrees, an overview of the main outcomes presented by Marco Bindi, University of Florence, and moderated by Carlo Barbante of the Italian Society for Climate Sciences. If you have any question on the CMCC webinar series, you can find all the details in the next slide, please, where you have the email address webinar@cmcc.it, and also the recording of this webinar will be available on the CMCC YouTube channel and on CMCC website. I thank all the participants for staying with us, and the presenter and the discussant from our side. Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.